This is a quick tour on how to install and configure the MVS Toolkit. What we'll cover today is MVS Toolkit architecture, installing the Toolkit client and server over Windows, installing the Toolkit server over Linux, configuring the Toolkit, testing the Toolkit, and web service export and import. Let's talk about installing the Toolkit over Windows. This can either be a complete client and server install if you plan to run the Toolkit server over Windows, or a client-only install if you're planning to run the Toolkit server over Linux. First, you must download the installer from the Rocket Customer Portal, or RCP. Unless there are other factors in play, you'll want to install the latest version, which is 2.3.1 at the time of this writing. If you must adhere to 32-bit architecture, you could also install version 2.2.3. But I recommend 2.3.1 or higher, as there are some significant improvements and the benefits of 64-bit architecture. Please note that these installers are rather large, up to 300 megabytes. So before downloading, make sure you have room on your system, not only for the installer, but everything it installs. I wouldn't install on a system with less than half a gig of free space. Once downloaded, the installation is relatively easy. Just double-click and answer the questions. In the following slides, I'll show you screenshots of where I did not take the defaults in the installer. In the Choose Install Set dialog, click the Custom Radio button, then click Next. In the Select Rocket MVS Install Components dialog, leave the Rocket MVS Web Server box checked if you're doing a server install on the Windows box, or uncheck it if you're doing a client-only install on Windows for use with a Linux server install. Leave the Rocket MVS Toolkit box checked unless for some reason you're installing only the server portion on this Windows box. Then click Next. In the Choose Client Configuration Files folder dialog, please choose a folder text box to read C Users Public, then click Next. This makes sure that anyone logged into this Windows instance can see the configuration, not just the user who's installing the toolkit. In the Web Server Configuration dialog, change the web server name text box to anything but localhost. This can be an IPv4 address or any name that will resolve to an IPv4 address. You may need to set up an entry in the Windows System32 drivers etc host file to resolve this. More on that in the debugging section. Click Next and follow the installer to completion. Now let's talk about installing the toolkit over Linux. This will be a server-only install. If you didn't download the Linux installer from RCP when you downloaded the Windows installer, go do that now and make sure you get the same version as the Windows installer, either 2.2.3 or 2.3.1. Remember to make sure there's at least half a gig of Linux disk space free before you download the installer. As with the Windows installer, the installation is relatively easy. In the following slides, I'll show you screenshots of where I did not take the defaults in the installer. First thing you'll need to do is set execute permissions on the installer. So do a chmod 777 rocket mvs setup.whatever. Then run the installer with a // in front of the name. When prompted, select 2 to do a custom install and press enter. When prompted, change the web server name to anything but localhost. Keep pressing enter to follow the installer to completion. Once the installation is completed, use netstat to verify that you have listeners on TCP ports 3410 and 8181.